The March fog rolled heavily over Bloomsbury, softening the edges of lamps and muting the colors of the world. When Miss Lydia Harcourt first discovered that the portrait was missing, she had gone into the gallery, shawl pulled tightly about her shoulders, intending only to look once more at the work that had been her family's treasure for 2 generations. Yet the wall where it had hung, between Sir John's grim likeness and the faded landscape of Kent, gaped bare. The frame, carved oak with gilt flourishes, remained fixed in its place, but the canvas itself had vanished as if spirited away. There was no torn cloth, no fallen dust, not even the faintest smudge of disturbance on the paneling. The Harcourt portrait had simply ceased to exist. The gallery doors were locked, as they had been all night. Only Lydia possessed a key, and she had not opened it since the evening before, when her cousin had admired the portrait at supper. The windows, shuttered from within, bore no sign of tampering. Even the servants, questioned at once, could give no account, for none had stepped foot into the gallery. It was as if the canvas had evaporated in the dim hush of midnight. Lydia, pale with confusion, sent instantly for Inspector Charles Fenton, whose reputation for keen sight had brought him fame in several curious London cases. Fenton arrived with deliberate calm, his hat brim dripping with the mist from outside. He was shown to the gallery, where Lydia waited in evident agitation, fingers twisting at her handkerchief. The inspector stood before the empty frame, eyes narrowing, lips pressed tight. He examined the gilded corners, the iron hooks, the stretchers that should have held the canvas taut. Then he looked to the floor, polished oak, without the faintest scratch or drag mark. "Impossible," Lydia whispered. "And yet, there it is. Gone." "Nothing is impossible, Miss Harcourt," Fenton replied, though his voice carried more curiosity than certainty. He turned slowly, scanning the tall windows with their shutters bolted from inside, the locked double doors behind him, the high ceiling where chandeliers dangled unhelpfully. A locked room, but the theft was undeniable. The portrait itself was no ordinary painting. It depicted Sir Ambrose Harcourt, Lydia's great-grandfather, in scarlet robes of state, holding a curious book of accounts. The artistry was fine but not exceptional. Its value lay not so much in technique as in history, for Sir Ambrose had been both influential and notorious in his day. Rumor said that the portrait concealed a secret, though none in living memory could say what. Fenton wondered if that rumor had stirred some greedy hand to theft. He questioned the household. The butler, solemn and precise, affirmed that all doors had been locked by 10 o'clock. The housemaid swore she had dusted the corridor near the gallery at dawn and noticed nothing unusual. The cook, busy with breakfast, had neither seen nor heard a thing. The only visitor the previous evening had been Lydia's cousin, Gerald Harcourt, who had dined, admired the portrait, and left by 9:30. He lived only 2 streets away. Gerald was the last to see it then. Fenton asked, eyes sharp. "Yes," Lydia said. "He has always spoken fondly of the painting. It was my grandfather's wish that it remain here, though Gerald, well, he sometimes hints it belongs equally to him. A motive, perhaps. Yet how could Gerald have managed such a theft? The gallery doors had been locked after he left, and the windows fastened. Unless he had hidden within the house overnight. But the servants swore they had seen no trace of him." Fenton leaned close to the frame, tracing its edge with a gloved finger. At one corner, faintly, he found a residue, a dusting of white powder, almost invisible in the low light. He dabbed it with his fingertip, sniffed, then frowned. It was not plaster, nor ordinary dust. He said nothing, but pocketed a sample in his handkerchief. His eyes lifted to the ceiling, then to the carpet runner at the gallery's entrance. The footprints there were few, mostly Lydia's small slippers and the butler's heavy shoes. Yet near the doorframe, faint as breath, was a different mark, longer, thinner, the sole of a man's boot, pointing inward. And beside it, almost absurd in its clarity, the smudge of what appeared to be chalk. "Curious," Fenton murmured. A chalked boot print in a locked room. The discovery did not resolve matters, it only deepened the impossibility. Chalk might suggest an artist, or a workman, yet none had been admitted to the house. And why would a thief, so careful as to leave no trace of entry or exit, mark the floor with chalk? It seemed random, misleading, like the jest of a conjurer. That afternoon, Gerald Harcourt arrived, summoned by Lydia. He came briskly, all confidence and charm, but his eyes flicked quickly to the empty frame. "Gone, you say? Extraordinary. But surely you misremember. The portrait cannot simply vanish. You saw it last night." Lydia insisted. "You admired it. You know it was here." Gerald smiled faintly. Indeed, I said as much. And yet, well, if it is gone, it must be thieves. London is full of them." Fenton studied Gerald keenly. His gloves bore no powder or stain, but his waistcoat pocket carried a stick of chalk worn at the tip. When asked, Gerald explained he had come directly from his club, where he had marked billiard scores. Perfectly reasonable, yet the coincidence gnawed at Fenton. Evening fell. Fenton lingered in the gallery, testing the shutters, the locks, the frame itself. At last, he pressed against the paneling behind the frame, and a small portion yielded slightly under pressure. A hidden seam, almost invisible, ran down one side. But the panel did not open. It merely gave the faintest hint of movement, enough to suggest design. The inspector stood back, lips tightening. "A vanished portrait in a locked room," he said softly. "And a clue that makes no sense at all." The case had begun, and it was already twisting into the realm of the impossible, where truth hides behind false appearances and the simplest marks. A chalked boot print, a faint seam in wood, may carry the weight of revelation. Yet for now, the portrait remained vanished and the crime unsolvable. The following morning brought with it a raw wind that rattled the shutters and carried the chill of early spring through the streets. Inspector Fenton returned to Harcourt House, armed with a determination sharpened by a night of restless thought. He had requested that the room remain untouched, the servants forbidden to sweep or dust, for it was in those smallest traces that truth might lie concealed. Lydia awaited him in the drawing-room, her anxiety deepened by sleeplessness. Gerald had not returned since the previous evening, but she assured Fenton her cousin would call again soon. He never stayed far from family business when it involved inheritance. Fenton climbed the staircase to the gallery once more, this time with a notebook tucked into his coat and a thin magnifier clasped in his hand. The servants followed him nervously at a distance, their eyes darting toward the empty frame, as if expecting the portrait to reappear in a spectral fashion. He ignored them, intent upon the details no one else had thought to question. His first act was to kneel before the faint seam in the paneling, probing delicately with the tip of a penknife. The wood resisted, but there was a slight give, as though some hidden fastening lay just beyond reach. It was not the casual crack of old timber, but a deliberate join. Whoever had designed this gallery had built a secret into it. Though whether for concealment or for some more practical purpose, Fenton could not yet be sure. He shifted his attention to the carpet runner near the entrance, where the chalked boot print lingered faintly. The housemaid, under orders, had refrained from brushing it away. Fenton examined the mark with his magnifier. It was not merely chalk dust. It bore the impression of a line, straight and deliberate, across the heel. A mason's boot, perhaps, or one used in some trade where chalk marked measurement. Yet what workman could have entered unseen, in the night, and departed without unlocking a single door? As he pondered this, the butler entered to announce the arrival of the local constabulary. 2 uniformed men came briskly up, their boots echoing sharply, and at once set about their routine inquiries. They took statements from Lydia and the servants, measured the frame, and peered at the shutters. One officer even tried to lift the frame from the wall, only to find it solidly bolted. To their eyes, the matter was plain enough. A clever thief had found some unobserved means of entry, carried off the canvas, and departed. They promised to circulate word at the pawnshops and to question the neighborhood, and with that they prepared to leave, satisfied that nothing further could be done on the spot. Fenton, however, remained by the frame, thoughtful. He noted the impatience with which Gerald Harcourt reappeared just as the officers were departing. Gerald swept into the room with a flourish, protesting loudly that Scotland Yard should already be scouring the city for the painting. He paced the gallery, gesturing at the bare wall with exaggerated despair, but when Fenton observed him closely, he saw a flicker in the man's expression, something too quick for the constables to notice. A glance that lingered not on the missing portrait, but on the panelling behind the frame. It was no more than a second's hesitation, but it suggested knowledge he ought not to possess. "You seem quite distressed, Mr. Harcourt," Fenton remarked quietly. "Who would not be?" Gerald replied, forcing a smile. "It was a treasure of our family. I can scarcely believe thieves have taken it. What next? Will they strip the curtains from the windows?" "Perhaps," Fenton said, "though I think thieves are not in the habit of leaving chalked boot prints where they tread." Gerald's smile faltered. "Chalk? What chalk?" Said Fenton smoothly, "a small trace near the door. Nothing worth troubling you about." Yet he saw the way Gerald's hand twitched toward his waistcoat pocket, where the billiard chalk had rested yesterday. When Gerald left, excusing himself for urgent business at his club, Fenton turned to Lydia, who had observed the exchange with unease. "Your cousin is quick to dramatize, but slower to explain. Tell me, Miss Harcourt, did Sir Ambrose, whose portrait is missing, ever leave behind writings about the painting?" Lydia thought a moment, brow furrowed. "There is an old story," she admitted. "My grandfather used to say that Sir Ambrose had hidden certain papers, letters perhaps, or accounts of a dubious nature, behind the canvas itself. It was only a family tale, nothing more. No one ever found anything." That struck Fenton as significant. A hidden compartment in the paneling, an old rumor of documents behind the portrait. A cousin too quick to conceal knowledge. He did not believe in coincidences, least of all when an heir stood to gain from secrecy. As the afternoon waned, Fenton conducted a closer survey of the servants' quarters. In the scullery he noticed something that the constables had passed by, a length of twine, dusted faintly with chalk, coiled neatly atop a bucket. When he asked the maid, she swore it was not hers. The twine was thin but strong, of the sort used to lower or raise objects discreetly. Fenton pocketed it, filing it with the growing puzzle. Chalk on a boot, chalk on a string, and a vanished painting. Returning to the gallery at dusk, he stood alone before the empty frame once more. The house had grown quiet. Lydia retired to her chamber. Only the ticking of a clock disturbed the silence. He placed the twine against the seam in the paneling, aligning it in thought with the height of the missing canvas. Yes, it was conceivable that the portrait had not left the house at all, but been drawn upward, concealed behind a false wall. Yet to prove it required care, for any false move might alert Gerald, who clearly watched every development with keen, possessive interest. Fenton let his eyes drift across the floor, the walls, the furniture. Then his gaze fixed upon something so slight it might have escaped a less practiced observer. The faint displacement of dust upon the gallery's far window-sill. Though the shutters were closed, a narrow line betrayed that the sill had been brushed recently. Not opened, no, the bolts were intact, but brushed, as though a hand had steadied itself there. Why? To lean and listen? To measure some distance? He leaned closer, fingers brushing the dust. It carried the same fine powder as before, a chalky trace that tied this odd gesture to the bootprint and the twine. 3 signs of the same hand, yet each appearing as though left deliberately, like clues in a game. Was Gerald arrogant enough to plant them? Or was another presence mocking the search with misleading tokens? The air grew colder, the silence pressing. Fenton straightened, pocketing his findings. He now possessed enough fragments to know that deception hovered close, though its form remained veiled. The portrait had not vanished into thin air. That much was certain. Someone in this house knew precisely where it had gone, and that someone was weaving a veil of chalk-dusted misdirection to shield the truth. For now, the mystery deepened, but Fenton's eye had caught what others had overlooked. A secret seam, a smudged sill, a too hasty gesture from a nervous cousin. They were threads waiting to be drawn together, and he intended to draw them tight until the fabric of deception tore open. Inspector Fenton did not leave Harcourt House that night. The gallery's chill air, the faintly perfumed corridors, and the uneasy hush that pressed upon the servants convinced him the truth lay waiting within those walls, and he was not prepared to abandon it to the night. He requested that Lydia gather all members of the household early the following morning, including Gerald, for a full account of the hours before the disappearance. If deception was at work, it would unravel best when threads were compared side by side. They assembled in the drawing-room just after breakfast. Lydia sat stiffly on a high-backed chair, her face pale but resolute, while Gerald lounged with studied ease by the mantelpiece, twirling his watch chain with an air of careless amusement. The butler, Graves, stood behind Lydia, his posture straight as an oak post, and the housemaid Alice lingered nervously near the door, twisting her apron. Cook was absent, too busy with the morning's preparations, but her account had already been taken down. Fenton began without flourish, his tone even, inviting rather than accusatory. "Let us be precise. Each of you shall tell me, in your own words, the course of last evening from supper until the morning discovery. Speak plainly, and note any detail however slight." Lydia went first. She recounted how they had dined at 7:30, Gerald present at her invitation. They had spoken of family matters, of the portrait, of Sir Ambrose's stern expression captured by the long, dead painter. At 9 o'clock, Gerald had excused himself, claiming an appointment at his club. Lydia had then locked the gallery at 9:30 herself, as was her custom, and retired upstairs with a book. She had not stirred again until morning, when she discovered the loss. Her voice trembled slightly as she spoke, but her words bore the ring of simple truth. Gerald took his turn next. Straightening from the mantel with a flourish, he confirmed Lydia's account of supper, adding unnecessary color to his description of the wine and the conversation, as though to prove his memory's sharpness. He admitted freely to admiring the portrait once more before leaving, even jesting that it looked door enough to frighten away burglars. Then, according to him, he had departed promptly, walking the short distance to his club, where he had remained until after midnight in the company of several gentlemen, who, he assured Fenton, could verify his presence. His account was delivered smoothly, Yet Fenton noted how Gerald's eyes flicked quickly toward Lydia at certain moments, as though gauging her reaction, and how his tone grew too polished, too eager to fill every gap. When Graves spoke, his manner was precise, as befitted a man of long service. He described locking the outer doors at 10, extinguishing lamps, and passing briefly by the gallery corridor to ensure all was quiet. He had neither seen nor heard anything amiss. Yet when Fenton pressed him, had he noticed whether the gallery shutters were closed when he walked past? Graves hesitated. "I believe they were," he said at last, his voice a shade less certain, "though it is my habit to assume Miss Lydia secures them. A small crack, but a crack nonetheless, in the butler's otherwise polished account." Alice, the maid, spoke last. Her hands twisted nervously, her voice low. She had gone to her attic room at 10 after finishing her chores, she said, and slept soundly. Yet as Fenton guided her gently, asking if she had passed through the gallery corridor that evening, she faltered. I thought I heard something," she admitted at last. "Just before I went upstairs. A sort of soft scrape, like wood on wood. I thought it must be the wind against the shutters, so I hurried along." I didn't want to be scolded for dawdling. Her eyes darted quickly toward Graves as she said it. And Fenton did not miss the butler's slight tightening of the jaw. The contradictions, though slight, were beginning to form a pattern. Lydia's account was straightforward, yet Gerald's too polished. Graves had left a small uncertainty about the shutters, and Alice admitted to hearing something that did not fit the rest. Fenton leaned back in his chair, letting silence press upon them. People spoke most freely when silence grew heavy. It was Gerald who broke first with a laugh too loud. "Really, Inspector? Must we pick apart every servant's measured sound? Surely it is plain enough. A thief came in some clever fashion, carried off the portrait, and vanished. Why waste time in this house when you might scour the city?" "Because, Mr. Harcourt," Fenton said mildly, "a clever thief would not leave traces of chalk in 3 separate places within these walls. He would not leave boot prints pointing inward, but none leading outward. And he would not choose to vanish a portrait whose value lies not in the canvas, but in the secrets it may have concealed. That is why we speak here." Gerald's face tightened, the mask slipping for a breath before he recovered it with another forced smile. "Then I wish you success, Inspector. I shall, of course, offer every assistance." When the gathering dispersed, Fenton requested a private word with Alice. She lingered by the door, wary of being overheard. "You heard more than you said, didn't you?" he asked quietly. Her eyes widened, then lowered. "I perhaps." "I thought I heard a voice, sir, low, as though someone spoke to themselves. But I was afraid to say. Graves told me once that imagining things made a maid seem flighty, and I can't afford to lose my place." "What kind of voice?" "A man's, sir. Not Mr. Gerald's, I think, but deeper. Just for a moment." Then it stopped. Fenton thanked her, dismissing her with a kind word, though his thoughts sharpened. A man's voice, low and fleeting. In a gallery locked and shuttered. Either Gerald had not left as he claimed, or another presence lurked within Harcourt House unseen. And Graves's steady pressure upon the servants to silence their doubts seemed less the discipline of a butler than the caution of one with something to hide. That evening, Gerald returned once more, his manner oddly urgent. He pressed Lydia to dine with him at his home, arguing that it would ease her mind to leave Harcourt House for a time. Lydia, wary but polite, refused. Fenton, observing, saw the flicker of frustration cross Gerald's face before he masked it again with charm. Too eager, thought Fenton. Far too eager to move her away from these walls. When Gerald departed, Fenton took another turn about the gallery alone. His lamp flickered upon the paneling. The empty frame, the floorboards where chalk still lingered faintly. He placed his ear against the seam in the wood, holding his breath. For a long moment, nothing stirred. Then, faint, almost inaudible, he caught the suggestion of air moving beyond, as though a hollow space lay hidden. He stepped back slowly, the weight of each contradiction pressing upon his mind. Gerald's too perfect alibi, Graves's uncertain shutters, Alice's whispered voice. They were fragments of a story not yet whole, a tale of deceit where every player held back something vital. But deception cannot hold forever. Already, the mask was slipping, and beneath it waited the first glimpse of the truth. Inspector Fenton did not leave Harcourt House that night. The gallery's chill air, the faintly perfumed corridors, and the uneasy hush that pressed upon the servants convinced him the truth lay waiting within those walls. And he was not prepared to abandon it to the night. He requested that Lydia gather all members of the household early the following morning, including Gerald, for a full account of the hours before the disappearance. If deception was at work, it would unravel best when threads were compared side by side. They assembled in the drawing room just after breakfast. Lydia sat stiffly on a high-backed chair, her face pale but resolute, while Gerald lounged with studied ease by the mantelpiece, twirling his watch chain with an air of careless amusement. The butler, Graves, stood behind Lydia, his posture straight as an oak post, and the housemaid Alice lingered nervously near the door, twisting her apron. Cook was absent, too busy with the morning's preparations, but her account had already been taken down. Fenton began without flourish, his tone even, inviting rather than accusatory. "Let us be precise. Each of you shall tell me, in your own words, the course of last evening from supper until the morning discovery. Speak plainly and note any detail, however slight." Lydia went first. She recounted how they had dined at 7:30, Gerald present at her invitation. They had spoken of family matters, of the portrait, of Sir Ambrose's stern expression captured by the long, dead painter. At 9 o'clock, Gerald had excused himself, claiming an appointment at his club. Lydia had then locked the gallery at 9:30 herself, as was her custom, and retired upstairs with a book. She had not stirred again until morning, when she discovered the loss. Her voice trembled slightly as she spoke, but her words bore the ring of simple truth. Gerald took his turn next, straightening from the mantel with a flourish. He confirmed Lydia's account of supper, adding unnecessary color to his description of the wine and the conversation, as though to prove his memory's sharpness. He admitted freely to admiring the portrait once more before leaving, even jesting that it looked door enough to frighten away burglars. Then, according to him, he had departed promptly, walking the short distance to his club, where he had remained until after midnight in the company of several gentlemen who, he assured Fenton, could verify his presence. His account was delivered smoothly, yet Fenton noted how Gerald's eyes flicked quickly toward Lydia at certain moments, as though gauging her reaction, and how his tone grew too polished, too eager to fill every gap. When Graves spoke, his manner was precise, as befitted a man of long service. He described locking the outer doors at 10, extinguishing lamps, and passing briefly by the gallery corridor to ensure all was quiet. He had neither seen nor heard anything amiss. Yet, when Fenton pressed him, had he noticed whether the gallery shutters were closed when he walked past? Graves hesitated. "I believe they were," he said at last, his voice a shade less certain. "Though it is my habit to assume Miss Lydia secures them. A small crack, but a crack nonetheless, in the butler's otherwise polished account." Alice, the maid, spoke last. Her hands twisted nervously, her voice low. She had gone to her attic room at 10 after finishing her chores, she said, and slept soundly. Yet as Fenton guided her gently, asking if she had passed through the gallery corridor that evening, she faltered. I thought I heard something, she admitted at last. Just before I went upstairs. A sort of soft scrape, like wood on wood. I thought it must be the wind against the shutters, so I hurried along. I didn't want to be scolded for dawdling. Her eyes darted quickly toward Graves as she said it, and Fenton did not miss the butler's slight tightening of the jaw. The contradictions, though slight, were beginning to form a pattern. Lydia's account was straightforward, yet Gerald's too polished. Graves had left a small uncertainty about the shutters, and Alice admitted to hearing something that did not fit the rest. Fenton leaned back in his chair, letting silence press upon them. People spoke most freely when silence grew heavy. It was Gerald who broke first with a laugh too loud. Really, Inspector? Must we pick apart every servant's measured sound? Surely it is plain enough. A thief came in some clever fashion, carried off the portrait, and vanished. Why waste time in this house when you might scar the city? Because, Mr. Harcourt, Fenton said mildly, a clever thief would not leave traces of chalk in 3 separate places within these walls. He would not leave boot prints pointing inward but none leading outward. And he would not choose to vanish a portrait whose value lies not in the canvas, but in the secrets it may have concealed. That is why we speak here. Gerald's face tightened, the mask slipping for a breath before he recovered it with another forced smile. Then I wish you success, Inspector. I shall, of course, offer every assistance. When the gathering dispersed, Fenton requested a private word with Alice. She lingered by the door, wary of being overheard. You heard more than you said, didn't you? He asked quietly. Her eyes widened, then lowered. Perhaps. I thought I heard a voice, sir. Low. As though someone spoke to themselves. But I was afraid to say. Graves told me once that imagining things made a maid seem flighty. And I can't afford to lose my place. What kind of voice? A man's, sir. Not Mr. Gerald's, I think, but deeper, just for a moment. Then it stopped. Fenton thanked her, dismissing her with a kind word, though his thoughts sharpened. A man's voice, low and fleeting. In a gallery locked and shuttered. Either Gerald had not left as he claimed, or another presence lurked within Harcourt House unseen. And Graves's steady pressure upon the servants to silence their doubts seemed less the discipline of a butler than the caution of one with something to hide. That evening, Gerald returned once more, his manner oddly urgent. He pressed Lydia to dine with him at his home, arguing that it would ease her mind to leave Harcourt House for a time. Lydia, wary but polite, refused. Fenton, observing, saw the flicker of frustration cross Gerald's face before he masked it again with charm. Too eager, thought Fenton. Far too eager to move her away from these walls. When Gerald departed, Fenton took another turn about the gallery alone. His lamp flickered upon the paneling. The empty frame, the floorboards where chalk still lingered faintly. He placed his ear against the seam in the wood, holding his breath. For a long moment, nothing stirred. Then, faint, almost inaudible, he caught the suggestion of air moving beyond, as though a hollow space lay hidden. He stepped back slowly, the weight of each contradiction pressing upon his mind. Gerald's too perfect alibi, Graves's uncertain shutters, Alice's whispered voice. They were fragments of a story not yet whole, a tale of deceit where every player held back something vital. But deception cannot hold forever. Already, the mask was slipping, and beneath it waited the first glimpse of the truth. Fenton stood in the gallery long after the household had retired, the dim glow of his lamp catching on the gilt edges of the empty frame. The hollow draught behind the panel seemed to whisper at him, a reminder that somewhere within these walls lay both the portrait and the truth. Yet he knew better than to force the panel open in secret. The key to this puzzle was not brute discovery, but the slow unpicking of motives. For the portrait had vanished, yes, but its disappearance was only the surface of a deeper game. By morning, his mind was sharpened by hours of reflection. Gerald, Lydia Graves, Alice, all had offered accounts, and all carried shadows in their words. Now he must probe not only their contradictions but their desires. For theft rarely occurs without motive. He summoned Lydia first, inviting her to walk with him in the garden before breakfast. The air was damp, the gravel crunching beneath their feet. Lydia's composure was fragile but honest. "Inspector," she said, clutching her shawl, "you believe Gerald capable of this? He can be reckless, but theft from his own family." Fenton studied her carefully. "Capability and motive are not the same, Miss Harcourt. But your cousin stands to gain much, does he not?" Her lips pressed tight. "Yes. If the portrait concealed papers, if they related to Sir Ambrose's questionable dealings, it is possible Gerald thought to secure them for himself. There has always been a tension between us, though I tried to maintain peace. My father was clear in his will the house, and its contents remain mine. Gerald resents that. Resentment, a powerful seed for theft. Yet Fenton saw something more in Lydia's eyes. Fear, not only of Gerald's ambition, but of what might be revealed if those hidden papers came to light. "Tell me," he asked softly, "are you certain you wish the portrait recovered?" Her silence was telling. When she finally spoke, her voice was low. "I must wish it. Yet I dread what might be found with it. My great-grandfather was not a man of spotless honor. If his secrets are uncovered, they might stain the family name. Fear of disgrace. Lydia's motive, then, was not to steal, but to conceal. She might, in desperation, have contrived to hide the portrait herself, to bury the past. But the manner of the theft, the chalk, the smudged sill, did not fit her quiet character. Later that morning, Fenton turned his questions upon Graves. The butler received him in the servants' hall, hands folded neatly before him. His loyalty to the household was long established, but loyalty could mask much. "You served Sir Ambrose himself, did you not?" Fenton began. Graves inclined his head. "As a young footman, yes. A stern master, but fair." "Then you would know better than most whether rumors of hidden papers had foundation." The butler's eyes flickered, just once. "Rumors are the sport of idle tongues, sir. I concern myself with facts, such as whether the shutters were closed." Fenton said lightly, "Which you claimed last night, but with less certainty than one might expect." A pause, long enough to betray unease. Graves straightened. "If I erred, it was only in the lateness of the hour. I patrol faithfully, Inspector. I should not like to be doubted after so many years." Fenton allowed the matter to rest outwardly, but inwardly he marked the hesitation. Graves, too, had a motive, loyalty twisted into fear. If Sir Ambrose's secrets threatened Lydia, they threatened the household name he had served all his life. To prevent disgrace, might not a faithful butler take matters into his own hands? Alice, when called aside later, revealed yet another thread. She admitted shyly that Gerald had spoken to her more than once in the corridor, urging her to leave doors unlatched at night, promising her coin if she helped him gain a little advantage. She had always refused, frightened of being caught, but her confession made Fenton's thoughts quicken. Gerald was not merely careless, he had actively sought accomplices. By afternoon, The web was tightening. Gerald, with his greed and envy, Lydia, with her fear of scandal, Graves, with his devotion to reputation, Alice, with her temptation toward a bribe. Each possessed reason enough to touch the portrait, but none explained the chalked clues fully. The chalk, so blatant, so carelessly placed, might have been Gerald's folly, yet the hollow seam in the panel suggested a deeper knowledge of the house. Something more in Graves's domain, and Lydia's dread of exposure lingered like a shadow at the edge of every answer. Fenton spent the evening mapping the strands aloud to himself in the gallery. Gerald desires control, Lydia dreads disgrace, Graves fears dishonor, Alice fears poverty. 4 motives, each tangled with the portrait's fate. Yet the crime itself bears 2 faces, too bold and too secretive. A portrait cannot vanish through locked doors unless aided by hidden architecture, and only one who knows this house intimately could act so. As though summoned by his thoughts, Gerald appeared again that night, uninvited, striding into the gallery where Fenton stood. "Still no sign?" he asked, feigning casual interest. "On the contrary," Fenton said, eyes fixed on him. "Signs are everywhere. Too many, in fact. One might almost believe they were left for me to find." Gerald's composure slipped into irritation. "If you suspect me, say so plainly. But you cannot prove what is not true. I was at my club. And yet," Fenton replied softly, "you were eager to lure Miss Lydia from this house. Almost desperate, I'd say. Why, if not to keep her from discovering something here?" Gerald stiffened, his jaw tightening. "You twist every word. If you wish for an enemy, Inspector, you've made one." With that, he stormed out, boots striking the floor like a drumbeat of defiance. Fenton remained unmoved. Gerald's bluster only confirmed his suspicion. Yet the cousin's motive alone did not explain the faint voice Alice had heard, nor the hollow seam in the wall. It was as if 2 hands had worked upon this crime, one bold and careless, the other cautious and secretive. A partnership, perhaps. Or an opportunist exploiting another's scheme. That night, as the house settled into uneasy slumber, Fenton wrote his notes by lamplight. He saw not a single line of guilt, but a maze of motives crossing and tangling. To step wrongly might send him chasing shadows, to tread carefully might lead him straight into the hidden heart of the deception. And still, beyond the panel, the faint draught whispered, as if the vanished portrait waited in silence, carrying with it the key to every secret these walls concealed. Morning broke with a brittle calm over Harcourt Hall, the sort of calm that felt rehearsed rather than real. Lydia sat at the head of the table, her pale composure restored, while Gerald lingered with a restless energy that betrayed little of the contempt he had flung at Fenton the night before. Graves served breakfast with measured silence, and Alice slipped between the rooms like a ghost. Beneath the surface, the household throbbed with unease. Fenton's night of reasoning had left him with more threads than knots, but the day did not wait for careful unraveling. Inspector Rotherham, the official representative of the local constabulary, arrived in blustering form, boots muddy from his morning ride, face ruddy with conviction. "Progress at last, Fenton," he declared before the assembled family. "We've found what you missed." From his satchel, Rotherham produced a folded cloth. Inside lay a piece of parchment, yellowed, creased, with handwriting scrawled across it in a hand that trembled with age. It bore Sir Ambrose Harcourt's signature. The inspector read aloud, voice swelling with triumph, "To my grandson Gerald. I entrust the keeping of certain matters unsuited for public knowledge. Should this letter be found, know it is linked to the portrait in the gallery." A hush swept the table. Gerald's head lifted sharply, eyes flashing with a mix of surprise and triumph. Lydia paled, her lips parting as though the words had struck her across the face. Graves did not flinch, though the tray he carried rattled faintly in his grip. Alice froze in the doorway, her hands tightening upon her apron. Rotherham looked round with satisfaction. There we have it. A confession of sorts, tying the portrait and Gerald together. The letter was found tucked in the lining of a desk drawer in Gerald's own chamber. You'll pardon me, Miss Lydia, but the case is plain enough. Your cousin stole the portrait, either to protect his inheritance or to destroy compromising documents. We'll have him in custody before sundown. The inspector's words were greeted by a storm of protest. Gerald sprang to his feet, slamming his hand upon the table. This is absurd! I never saw that letter in my life. If it was in my chamber, then someone planted it there. Lydia's voice wavered. But Gerald, you cannot deny the signature. It is grandfather's hand. I have seen it often enough. Forgery, Gerald snapped, though his face betrayed the faltering of certainty. Or some trick. Inspector, you cannot condemn me with such flimsy proof. Rotherham was unmoved. You have both motive and opportunity, young sir. The chalk, the shutters, the missing picture, all align with your presence in the gallery. And now this. He turned to Fenton with the air of a man who expected applause. I trust you'll agree, Inspector. Case closed. Fenton had remained silent throughout, his keen eyes upon the parchment. When at last he spoke, his voice was mild but edged with steel. Closed. No, Inspector. On the contrary, it has only just opened. Rotherham frowned, the certainty in his stance wavering. Come now, man. You're too fond of puzzles. The evidence is direct. Too direct. Fenton replied. He lifted the letter between careful fingers. Consider, sir. Why would Gerald, if guilty, hide so damning a document in his own chamber? Why not burn it? Why not destroy every trace? No. This is not the carelessness of a thief, but the cunning of one who wishes to see him condemned. The letter's discovery is convenient, too convenient. It arrives just as suspicion grew muddled, pointing the way to a single scapegoat. Gerald, though trembling with indignation, found a measure of relief in Fenton's words. You see, at least one of you has sense. But Fenton silenced him with a glance. Do not mistake my meaning. I have not absolved you. I merely say the truth is not so simple. The household murmured uneasily, and Lydia pressed a hand to her brow. Then what does it mean? Who would wish to frame Gerald so? Fenton's gaze drifted briefly to Graves, whose face betrayed nothing, then to Alice, who lowered her eyes quickly. That, he said, folding the parchment, is the question we must answer. But I will tell you this. The hand that placed this letter in Gerald's chamber did so with confidence that it would be found, and that Inspector Rotherham, in his eagerness, would seize upon it as decisive. It is a trap, not for Gerald, but for justice itself. Rotherham flushed with irritation. You doubt my judgment. I question the speed of it, Fenton said evenly. The portrait is still missing, is it not? Without it, no case can be complete. And until it is found, every piece of evidence is but a shadow. Yet, despite Fenton's warning, the machinery of authority moved swiftly. By afternoon, Gerald was taken into custody, protesting loudly at every step. Lydia wept quietly in her chamber, torn between relief and horror. Graves moved about his duties with somber diligence, while Alice hovered anxiously, as though fearing the walls themselves might whisper her secrets. The hall fell into a false calm once more, but Fenton felt the air tighten with menace. The real thief, emboldened by the authorities' haste, remained at large. Whoever had contrived the false letter now believed themselves beyond suspicion, free to complete their design, and that, Fenton knew, was the most dangerous moment of all. That night, he stood again in the gallery, staring at the empty frame. "You are not finished," he murmured to the silence. "You have struck once, and struck again with cunning. But you will strike once more when you think all eyes are elsewhere. And when you do, I will be waiting." The draught from the hidden panel brushed his cheek like a breath, and Fenton felt certain the portrait itself was near, its absence a lure for both the guilty and the innocent alike. Somewhere within these walls, the game was still being played. And though the world believed it ended, he knew the most perilous move was yet to come. The departure of Gerald under guard left Harcourt Hall unnervingly hollow, as though the house itself exhaled in uneasy relief. Yet for Fenton the silence was heavy with falsehood. He could not shake the thought that the real hand behind the theft now moved freely. Emboldened by the constabulary's hasty triumph, he lingered in the gallery long into the evening, studying the frame, the wall, the faint seam where the draught whispered through. His instincts told him that the portrait had never left the hall at all, but slumbered behind that panel, secreted away not for greed alone, but for something older, something buried. It was Graves who, perhaps unknowingly, offered the first spark that drew Fenton's thoughts backward through time. The butler had come quietly to draw the curtains, his steps deliberate, his face impassive. In the lamplight his shadow stretched long across the floorboards. Sir Ambrose, Graves murmured unprompted, would not have abided such disturbance to his house. He believed in order above all things. Fenton turned. "You knew him well, then?" "I was a young man when I entered service here. Many's the night I saw him pacing these very floors, muttering to himself. Always he feared that his enemies might unearth what was best left forgotten." "Enemies?" Fenton pressed. Graves hesitated. He was a man of business in troubled times. After the wars, fortunes were made and broken by those willing to tread upon others. There was a merchant, I recall, Ellison of Portsmouth. The quarrel was bitter, though the matter was hushed. Sir Ambrose triumphed, but Graves's voice dropped. There were whispers of forgery, of falsified ledgers. Ellison's son swore revenge when his father ruined himself and died. The name struck Fenton like a match to dry tinder. Ellison. He remembered reading it in the provincial files years before, a case that had never been resolved. A fire in the merchant's office, ruled accidental, but some suspected arson to cover fraud. If Sir Ambrose had indeed profited by such ruin, then the portrait might well conceal documents too dangerous to be exposed. Later that night, in the stillness of his chamber, Fenton pulled from his casebook a set of clippings he carried for reference. Among them he found the Ellison affair, dated nearly 30 years prior. What drew his attention most was the mention of a clerk who had turned witness, testifying in Sir Ambrose's favor. The clerk's name, Charles Graves. The revelation was subtle but powerful. Graves had not only served as butler, but once had stood at Sir Ambrose's side in matters of business. His loyalty forged in the fires of scandal. If anyone knew what the portrait concealed, it was he. And if the Ellison family's oath of revenge had echoed down the years, perhaps someone else within these walls bore its mark. The following morning, Fenton contrived to meet Lydia in the library, where she sat with a pile of old correspondence before her. Her hands trembled as she sorted through the brittle pages. "I could not sleep," she confessed. "I thought perhaps if I understood grandfather's dealings, I might understand why this portrait mattered so much." Fenton's gaze settled on the letters. "Do any of them mention Ellison?" She looked up sharply. "Ellison? Yes, here." She produced a folded sheet, the ink faded but legible. Your threats do not move me, it reads. Your claims are empty. My position is secure. Signed Ambrose Harcourt. Addressed to Thomas Ellison. Fenton studied the letter. So the quarrel was not idle rumor. It was real and bitter. Did your grandfather ever speak of it? Never, Lydia said softly. But I recall my father once warning me never to trust those who smile too easily in business. He said ruin had been wrought in this very house, and that we must guard the family name at all cost. The words carried weight. Guard the name. Conceal disgrace. Lydia's motive deepened, entwined with generations of secrecy. But Fenton's mind leapt further. If Gerald's blundering greed had made him easy prey, and Lydia's fear made her vulnerable, then Graves's loyalty made him dangerous. And yet, there remained Alice. He sought her out in the servants' wing, finding her polishing silver. She startled when he entered, nearly dropping a candlestick. Inspector, I beg pardon. Compose yourself, Alice. I have but a question. Did your family ever serve here before you? She blinked, clearly unprepared. My mother, sir. She was laundress for the household many years ago, before she married. Why? Your mother's name? Ellen. Ellen Ellison. The candlestick nearly slipped from his hand. Here was the link, the quiet, unconsidered connection that threw the entire case into new relief. Alice was of Ellison's line. The granddaughter of the very man Sir Ambrose had ruined. Her face paled as she read the recognition in his eyes. You cannot think. I had no part. Fenton's voice was calm but firm. Perhaps not the theft itself. But you know more than you have said. The night the portrait vanished, you heard a voice. Whose? Tears welled in her eyes. I thought it was Mr. Graves. He spoke in the corridor. It must be tonight, he said. I dared not tell. He has been kind to me. And if my family's name... She broke off, covering her face. The shadows of the past now loomed tall, their shapes unmistakable. Graves. Once the clerk who aided Sir Ambrose had become his protector in death, ensuring the secrets buried with the portrait would never see light. Alice, bound by blood to the ruined Ellisons, had stumbled upon the truth yet been silenced by fear. Lydia bore the weight of disgrace, Gerald the hunger for gain. And the portrait itself stood as the silent witness of a quarrel 30 years old. Fenton returned to the gallery with renewed clarity. The theft was not merely the act of one man for present gain, it was the echo of an old crime, reverberating through generations. The vanished portrait was the fulcrum upon which past and present balanced, and only by exposing both could the scales be set right. As he laid his hand upon the hollow panel, he felt the truth close at last. The case was not about the theft of paint and canvas alone, but about sins buried and secrets long concealed. The past had not vanished, it had merely waited in the shadows, and now it demanded reckoning. Fenton stood in the gallery, long after his conversation with Alice, the weight of the revelation pressing against him like the draught from the hollow panel. The portrait was not simply missing, it was silenced, and behind its silence lay graves of the past, both literal and figurative. Yet he knew better than to storm the panel now and wrench the truth into daylight. A thief expecting discovery would hide deeper or lash out. What he needed was not force, but a spark to pierce the calm masks worn by each suspect. An unconventional test. Something to draw from them the one slip of truth they could not control. The following evening, he arranged a gathering in the gallery itself. Lydia was summoned from her chamber, her composure brittle but proud. Graves appeared as though the command inconvenienced him, though his eyes gleamed with hidden calculation. Alice came pale and trembling, and even Inspector Rotherham, still flushed with the self-satisfaction of Gerald's arrest, joined with an air of superiority. Fenton had chosen this setting deliberately. The empty frame looming behind him, the hollow wall whispering its secrets just out of reach. "I have asked you here," Fenton began, "because the matter is not settled. A theft is not solved by accusation alone. The portrait remains hidden, and until it returns, truth cannot be claimed. Tonight, we shall attempt a different path." Rotherham scoffed. "Another of your parlor tricks. You play with shadows while the guilty man sits in a cell." "Perhaps," Fenton replied, his gaze steady. "But shadows have a way of betraying those who stand in them too long." He placed upon the table a small box of chalk, white and pristine. "This," he said, "is the same substance that marked the shutters. I will ask each of you in turn to write a single word upon this slate, your name, nothing more. It is a simple act, yet handwriting bears truth that speech cannot conceal." Lydia frowned but complied first, her hand elegant and steady. Graves followed, his letters neat and controlled. Alice hesitated, but with encouragement she too wrote, her script small and hurried. Rotherham, irritated, scrawled his name with heavy strokes. Fenton studied the slate in silence, then turned to the folded parchment that had been discovered in Gerald's chamber. He laid it beside the fresh inscriptions. The room held its breath as he compared the strokes. The curl of the lean of the S, the sharpness of the T. At last he looked up, his eyes fixed on Graves. "The hand that wrote this letter," he said softly, "is the same that wrote your name this evening." For the first time, the butler's composure cracked. His lips parted slightly, though no words came. The tremor in his fingers betrayed what his tongue could not. Rotherham blustered. "Impossible! The letter bore Sir Ambrose's signature." "The signature, yes," Fenton said. A clever forgery, practiced by one who had seen it often. But the body of the text was another matter. Handwriting cannot lie so easily. Graves wrote the letter that condemned Gerald. Lydia gasped, pressing a hand to her throat. Alice shrank back, her eyes wide with fear. Still Graves remained silent, his jaw clenched, until at last he said hoarsely, "I did what was necessary. Young Gerald is reckless. He would have torn this family to ruin if allowed near those papers. I meant only to see him removed from temptation." "But you lied," Fenton said. "You planted evidence. And more, you spoke the words Alice overheard. It must be, tonight. You, and you alone, hold the knowledge of the hidden panel behind this wall. Tell me, did you also hide the portrait?" The butler's eyes flickered toward the panel before he could stop himself. It was only a heartbeat, the smallest of glances, but in that instant his mask shattered. "Enough," Fenton said quietly, rising to his feet. "You have revealed what you sought to hide. The portrait lies within these walls still, secreted away by your hand. You forged a letter to frame Gerald, believing the world would accept the easy answer. But you miscalculated. Deception, once cracked, cannot be mended." Graves's shoulders sagged. For a moment he seemed aged beyond his years, the weight of decades pressing upon him. "Sir Ambrose trusted me," he whispered. "He made me guardian of his legacy. I could not let those papers be seen. They would destroy what he built, what Miss Lydia now holds. I meant no harm, only to protect." "Protection born of lies is no protection at all," Fenton replied. Yet he did not press further that night. Graves had shown his hand, and though the portrait's hiding place remained unopened, Fenton knew its secret was close. He dismissed the gathering, allowing each to retire, though their faces lingered heavy with shock. Lydia could not meet Graves's eyes. Alice fled swiftly. Rotherham grumbled, still unwilling to concede his folly. Fenton remained alone, the chalk still upon the table. His unconventional test had revealed more than 1,000 questions could. Graves's loyalty had turned into crime, and the past shadow had forced his hand. But Fenton also knew this was not the end. A man so deeply entrenched in secrecy would not yield the final piece so easily. The portrait still waited, silent in its hollow recess, and the true reckoning had yet to come. The gallery felt altered after Graves's slip, as though the walls themselves had shifted under the weight of his half-confession. Fenton lingered there after dismissing the household, convinced the portrait lay no more than inches beyond the hollow panel. But the night was not the time to pry it open, not while his adversary still prowled the house, watchful and desperate. He left the gallery with his thoughts sharpened, planning to confront Graves with the truth in daylight, when the balance of control would favor him. The morning, however, brought more than light. Lydia herself burst into the breakfast room, pale as marble, a crumpled paper trembling in her hands. "Inspector," she cried, "the letter! It's gone!" "The letter you showed us last night!" Fenton rose at once. "Gone? From where?" "From your case," she whispered. "I went to bring you tea just now, and your case stood open on the desk. The letter is not there." He strode to his chamber, and the truth greeted him starkly. The case was ajar, the lock unbroken yet clearly tampered with. The parchment, that damning forgery linking Graves to Gerald's downfall, had vanished. Whoever had stolen it knew that without the letter his proof became little more than accusation. Rotherham, summoned in haste, arrived with bluster. "So, your clever tricks end in nothing. The evidence you paraded before us vanished like smoke. What remains now but Gerald's guilt, plain as day?" Fenton met his eyes coldly. "It was no trick, Inspector. The theft of the letter only proves what I said last night. Someone here fears exposure more than justice, and they are willing to strike boldly in the very heart of this house." Suspicion swept the hall like a draught. Lydia's gaze wavered between Graves and Alice, her lips tight. Alice trembled openly, shrinking against the doorframe. Graves alone stood immovable, his face carved from stone, but his silence rang louder than words. Fenton felt the stakes tilt. Without the letter he could not confront Graves before the others. The butler would deny, and Rotherham would scoff. He must tread more carefully now, for the thief who had stolen the evidence was still at work, burying truth deeper with every step. That evening he took a deliberate risk. He returned to the gallery, leaving the door ajar, his lamp lit, his case set upon the table as though carelessly. Then he withdrew into the shadows, waiting. Hours passed, the silence broken only by the ticking of the great clock in the hall. At last, footsteps stirred the hush, measured, cautious, unmistakably deliberate. Through the crack of the door he saw Graves enter, his tall figure limned in the lamplight. He approached the table, his eyes fixed not on the case but on the frame itself. For a long moment he stood before it, head bowed, as though in communion with the vanished portrait. Then, with a hand that trembled faintly, he reached to the panel seam and pressed. The wall yielded with a muted click. A narrow recess gaped open, and there, shrouded in dust, leaned the portrait of Sir Ambrose Harcourt. The canvas bore a grim majesty, the painted eyes cold and imperious even in shadow. Behind it, bound to the back of the frame, a packet of papers bulged, yellow with age. Fenton stepped forward. "So, Mr. Graves, we come at last to the heart of it." The butler started, his composure shattering into raw fear. He turned, lips tightening, then straightened with a desperate dignity. "I could not let it be revealed," he said quietly. "Not the papers, not the truth. Sir Ambrose commanded it of me with his dying breath. My duty is not to law, Inspector, but to loyalty." "Your loyalty," Fenton said. has already led you to theft, to forgery, and now to destruction of evidence. Will you add one crime more?" Graves's gaze flicked to the packet. In that instant, Fenton saw his intent. He sprang forward, but the butler was quicker, snatching the papers from the frame. Graves tore them in half with sudden, brutal strength. Pages fluttered like wounded birds across the gallery, fragments scattering into the air. Fenton seized his arm before he could finish, wrenching the remnants away. But half was gone. Words, signatures, figures, all torn and ruined beyond repair. Graves sagged in his grip, his breath harsh. "Better ashes than disgrace," he muttered. The damage was done. The most damning proof of Sir Ambrose's corruption, of Ellison's ruin, was lost forever, and with it the clear line that would have bound past to present. Fenton forced Graves into a chair, his own voice taut with anger. "You have not saved the Harcourt name. You have condemned it to suspicion. Secrets rot deeper when they are half revealed. And now the true thief, whether you or another, moves in shadow still, emboldened by your folly." The remnants of paper lay strewn across the floor, half legible, half ash in waiting. The portrait loomed once more in its recess, its painted eyes seeming almost to mock the living. The stakes had shifted, evidence had vanished, truth had been mutilated, and the path forward lay darker than before. Fenton knew he had been dealt a blow, yet in that destruction a sliver of hope remained. The thief had acted too soon, too desperately. And desperation, in the end, was a weakness he could turn to his advantage. The fragments of paper still littered the gallery floor when Fenton locked Graves in the small anteroom adjoining the servants' quarters. The butler had offered no resistance after the frenzy of destruction, only a hollow resignation, as though the act had drained what strength remained in him. Yet the detective knew too well that the greater battle lay not with Graves, but with the hidden hand still orchestrating events. That hand had grown bolder, moving openly against him now, and it would not stop until the truth lay permanently buried. The house felt different that night, charged, restless, like a stage before a final act. Lydia retired early, pleading a headache, while Alice paced her chamber with nervous steps, her eyes darting at every sound. Rotherham left after a curt exchange with Fenton, muttering about wasted time. Fenton, refusing fatigue, sat in the study with lamp and papers spread before him, searching the half-legible scraps salvaged from the gallery. Names emerged like ghosts: Ellison, Ambrose, sums and dates scratched in ink. But the pattern was broken, threads severed where Graves had torn them. Near midnight, a muffled sound stirred him, a door closing somewhere above. He rose at once, lamp in hand, and mounted the staircase. The corridor was dark, the only light seeping beneath Lydia's door. He approached, knocked softly, then entered. The room was empty. Her bed was untouched, her cloak missing from the stand. Alarm flared through him. Lydia had vanished. He searched swiftly, the lamplight grazing across the room, no sign of struggle. No note, only the faint impression of hurried departure. A window stood slightly ajar, the night wind stirring the curtains. Fenton leaned out. Below, the gravel bore fresh marks, as though a carriage had waited there. The house roused in confusion when he raised the alarm. Alice, pale and trembling, clutched at him. She would not leave. She could not! Someone has taken her! Rotherham, summoned back by messenger, cursed and demanded explanations, while Graves, still confined, bellowed through the locked door that it was folly to suspect him when he had been secured all night. Fenton's thoughts raced. Lydia's disappearance was no accident. It was a move calculated with precision, striking at the very heart of his progress. By removing her, the hidden hand not only silenced a vital witness, but also drew suspicion onto every remaining soul in the house. Before dawn, grim confirmation arrived. A stable boy stumbled in, breathless, clutching a torn scrap of fabric. Lydia's cloak hem, found snagged on the hedge near the road. The boy swore he had seen a coach rumble away at speed not an hour past, bound toward the moor road. Rotherham ordered pursuit, but Fenton restrained him. "No wild chase," he said. "This abduction is not meant to end in discovery. It is meant to unseat us, to turn our reason into frenzy. Whoever commands these acts counts on our haste." Still, the tension cracked when Alice collapsed into a chair, sobbing. "They will kill her as they killed Gerald." The words struck like flint. The room stilled. Fenton crouched beside her, his voice steady. "You believe Gerald was murdered, Miss Ellison?" "Not broken by ruin, but slain." Her tears shimmered in the lamplight. "I did not dare to speak it. But yes, I believe it. He would never have ended his life, not of his own will. There was someone who profited from his fall." The revelation deepened the shadows. Gerald's death, long assumed self-inflicted, now stood as a probable murder, the first crime in a chain stretching into the present. If that were true, then Lydia's abduction was not random. It was a continuation, a tightening of the same news. By morning a letter arrived. It bore no seal, only Lydia's name scrawled across the fold. Fenton broke it open before the assembled company. The message was brief, its hand disguised. "Speak no more of the past. Cease your prying, or she will follow her brother. The earth has room for 2 Ellisons." Alice screamed at the sight of it. Rotherham swore vengeance, and Graves, hearing the uproar from his confinement, pounded the door until his fists bled. Fenton alone stood motionless, the paper trembling faintly between his fingers. The villain was ahead, well ahead. What had begun as an inquiry into missing art had grown into a game of life and death, where every piece moved against him. He had sought to untangle a forgery. Instead, he now faced a kidnapper and murderer who wielded fear as deftly as a blade. That night, as the household fell into uneasy silence, Fenton walked the halls alone, his lamp casting long shadows. He paused before the gallery, staring at the portrait still half concealed in its recess, its painted gaze cold and watchful. The torn papers lay secured in his case, fragments of a truth denied him. And beyond the walls, somewhere in the dark moor, Lydia lived, or died, at the whim of an enemy he had not yet unmasked. The case was no longer about stolen canvases or ruined reputations. It was about survival, about stopping a mind that killed to protect secrets buried decades deep. And Fenton, though wary, felt his resolve sharpen. The villain had struck boldly, but in doing so had revealed their greatest weakness, desperation cloaked in control. He knew then that the next move must be his, and it must be one the enemy could neither anticipate nor undo. For if he faltered now, Lydia Ellison would never return, and the truth would sink forever beneath shadows that stretched from the past into the present, long and lethal. The letter lay on Fenton's desk long after the others had retreated to restless sleep. Its brief, vicious words repeated themselves in his mind with the insistence of a drumbeat. "Cease your prying. Cease your prying." Yet it was not the threat that gnawed at him most, but the certainty that its author had moved freely enough to deposit it without detection. That meant the villain was close, far closer than the frightened household suspected. He spread the scraps salvaged from the destroyed folio once more across the lamplit desk, arranging them not as words, but as shapes, like fragments of a puzzle. Lines of figures intersected with names, and though many were broken, enough remained to form a chain. Ellison, Ambrose, St. James's Gallery, a date 2 years past. He tapped a finger lightly, his thoughts circling. 2 years. That was the year Gerald Ellison had suffered his ruin. The year Graves had taken ill for a long unexplained absence. The year Rotherham first entered the family's affairs. Too many threads knotted in that season, but the knottiest thread of all was Lydia. Her disappearance was no whim of the moment. It was a deliberate extraction, timed precisely to follow Graves's frantic outburst. Whoever had ordered her taken had done so to silence the very connections she might reveal. That meant she, too, had known something she had not dared yet to tell. Fenton leaned back, eyes closed. He sifted every word she had spoken since his arrival. They had all seemed the nervous outpourings of a troubled sister. Yet one remark now rose above the rest, gleaming in recollection. When she had shown him the recess where the portrait once hung, she had said with sudden vehemence, "Gerald hated that likeness. He swore it was not himself." At the time, Fenton had thought it mere family quarrel. But now, paired with the stolen portrait's odd proportions, with the forgery Graves had nearly destroyed, it struck with force. The portrait was not Gerald Ellison at all. Or, if it bore his likeness, it concealed another truth beneath the paint. That was why it had vanished. Why it alone of the household treasures was targeted, why Gerald's despair, or murder, had followed. The portrait was no mere art, it was evidence. He rose, lamp in hand, and went again to the gallery. The painted canvas, half hidden in its recess, stared back at him. He examined its frame, noting the fresh scratches along the back edges. Someone had prized it free recently, and not with skill. He fetched his blade, gently levering it out, and set the heavy piece upon a table. Then, working with deliberate care, he inspected the edges where the paint met canvas. There, a faint line, a ridge almost imperceptible, as though one layer of paint had been laid over another. A palimpsest. His pulse quickened. Beneath the current portrait lay another image, concealed deliberately. Perhaps Gerald himself had discovered it and recoiled, declaring it not himself. Perhaps that discovery had been his death warrant. The realization spun outward. The missing folios, Graves's terror, Lydia's abduction, each pointed not merely to theft or forgery, but to the suppression of some older crime immortalized in oil and pigment. At dawn he summoned Alice, weary but composed. "When your brother first saw this portrait," he asked quietly, "did he remark anything besides his dislike of it?" She frowned through her exhaustion. Only that the eyes were wrong. He said they were Ambrose's eyes, not his. I thought it nonsense. But he would not let it go. Ambrose. The name echoed again. Gerald had seen in his own portrait the features of another man. Ambrose, his former partner. Fenton returned to the papers Ambrose's name, linked with sums of money, the gallery. What if the portrait did not depict Gerald at all, but Ambrose, hidden beneath Gerald's likeness? And if Ambrose had been erased, why? The pattern emerged in sudden clarity. Gerald and Ambrose, bound in business, had quarreled. Ambrose had vanished, quietly, without public notice. Gerald had been ruined, declared disgraced, and later found dead. And the one image that might prove Ambrose's existence, or his fate, had been painted over, disguised as Gerald, then hidden, then stolen. The entire chain of calamity was tied to that canvas. Fenton's mind raced further. Who profited from Ambrose's disappearance? Who stepped into the breach of their ruined firm, acquiring contracts, properties, wealth? Rotherham. The man who had so readily offered his aid. Who had pressed for swift conclusions, who had bristled whenever the investigation slowed. And Graves. Faithful Graves. What of his desperate act? Fenton now saw it for what it was. The butler had not sought to obscure truth, but to protect it. He had known what lay beneath the portrait. He had perhaps even aided Gerald in uncovering it long ago. and in terror of what it meant, he had tried to destroy the last scraps before they could claim another life. The conclusion was not yet proof, but it was shape, form, structure. A pattern that revealed motive, opportunity, and fear. The villain had sought to erase Ambrose Ellison from the world, to assume his wealth and standing, to silence any who remembered. Gerald had been silenced first, Lydia taken second, and now the portrait itself stood as the last silent witness. Fenton covered the painting, concealing the ridge of paint once more. He would need skill to uncover its layers without ruin, skill that only a trusted restorer could provide. But he no longer doubted the path. The enemy was within the house, cloaked in respectability, striking from shadows, but their mask had slipped. The eyes in the portrait, Ambrose's eyes, were enough to guide him. As he extinguished the lamp, the gallery seemed less haunted than before. The chaos of scattered threads had begun to coalesce, weaving into a pattern at last. The vanished portrait was not an end but a beginning, and through its concealed image, the truth prepared to step into the light. Fenton sat rigid in the study, dawn pouring its grey light through the curtains. The pattern had begun to show itself, yet the more it sharpened, the more it unsettled him. The portrait was the hinge of everything, that much was clear. Beneath its painted surface lay a hidden truth. But what truth? That question haunted him. Money, power, business rivalry. These were motives enough for ruin or fraud, yet something about the ferocity of the acts suggested more than calculation. Gerald dead, Lydia stolen, Ambrose erased from canvas and memory alike. There was passion here, not merely profit. When Alice entered, her eyes hollow from sleeplessness, Fenton motioned her to sit. He spoke softly, drawing her into recollection. "Tell me again of Ambrose," he said. "What sort of man was he?" She hesitated. "I was a girl then, but I remember his visits." He laughed often, though Gerald said it was hollow. He admired his reflection in every mirror. Once, at dinner, he spoke of leaving a mark on the world, as though he thought himself destined to be remembered long after others had crumbled. Gerald grew angry and told him not all legacies were chosen. "Did he quarrel often with your brother?" "Yes," she whispered, though Gerald never told me why. After a time, Ambrose stopped coming. Then Gerald changed. He grew watchful, secretive, as though hunted by some shadow no one else could see. And then, her voice broke. And then he was gone. Her words settled heavily. Ambrose's hunger for remembrance, Gerald's dread of shadow, these were not the notes of business rivalry, but of something deeper, more personal. Later that day, Fenton confronted Graves in the locked anteroom. The butler, gaunt and exhausted, met his gaze with surprising steadiness. "You think me guilty," he rasped. "I think you know more than you have dared tell," Fenton returned. "You tried to burn the folios, not for gain, but from fear. Whom do you fear, Graves?" For a long moment silence reigned. Then, with sudden bitterness, Graves said, "I fear the dead." "The dead?" "Ambrose," he whispered, "but not as you think. Not his ghost, but his will. He was a man who could not bear to vanish. He made certain of it. When he quarreled with Mr. Gerald, it was not over coin, but over blood." Fenton leaned forward. "Blood?" Graves's lips tightened. Ambrose was Gerald's half-brother. The old master's shame. He was born of a woman never spoken of, yet he carried the Ellison features, those cursed eyes. He demanded his share, his place in the world. Gerald refused. He said Ambrose would tarnish the name. They fought fierce, bitter. After that night Ambrose was gone. But he left a mark, sir. He left himself painted, in secret by a hand he paid well. That portrait was his monument. He swore none could erase him, not even Gerald. The words struck like a blow. Fenton saw it then. The portrait was not a likeness of Gerald at all, but of Ambrose Ellison, the hidden son. When Gerald discovered it, he must have seen it as a threat to everything he stood for. Perhaps he tried to destroy it. Perhaps he tried to silence Ambrose himself. But if Ambrose had died, someone else had taken up his cause, or his name. He pressed Graves further, but the butler fell silent, trembling as though he had already said too much. The revelation twisted the case into new form. The crimes were not simply about wealth or revenge. They were about identity, legitimacy, the desperate need of one man to be remembered, to force his name into history, even if painted over the face of another. That obsession, carried forward by whoever now orchestrated the violence, explained the lengths to which they would go. Gerald's death, Lydia's abduction, the mutilated records, all served one aim: to erase denial and carve Ambrose Ellison's claim into permanence. That evening, Rotherham arrived again, his expression taut, his voice impatient. "You linger too long, Fenton. Every hour you spend musing is an hour Miss Lydia may be lost to us." Fenton watched him closely, weighing each word. "And yet," he said slowly, "our enemy does not wish her dead, yet. She is leverage, nothing more. They fear her memory, her testimony, what she might reveal. Then we must pay whatever ransom they demand." "No," Fenton answered. "There will be no ransom. This is not a crime of coin. It is a crime of legacy." Rotherham blinked at him, startled, but quickly masked it. Fenton caught the flicker all the same. Later, alone once more, he laid the pieces side by side. Ambrose Ellison, the unacknowledged son, had fought for recognition and vanished. Gerald had been destroyed soon after, perhaps by guilt, perhaps by design. And now Lydia had been stolen away to silence the one voice that might still expose the truth. But it was not merely family pride that fueled this darkness. It was Ambrose's obsession, his refusal to be forgotten, that lived on in someone else. Whether Rotherham, Graves, or another yet unseen, the villain had taken up Ambrose's cause with fanatical fervor. And therein lay the hidden motive, revealed at last. This was not about fortune alone. It was about rewriting the Ellison legacy, burning Gerald's denial from history, and enthroning Ambrose, dead or alive, as the rightful heir in memory, in portrait, in name. The crimes were acts of vengeance, yes, but more than vengeance. They were acts of creation, of obsession, a battle not for gold but for immortality. Fenton felt a chill unlike any before. He was not fighting a thief. He was not even fighting a murderer in the ordinary sense. He was fighting an idea. Ambrose's will to be remembered. A will so strong it had survived his death, embodied in another who would kill and kill again to ensure it triumphed. That realization hardened his resolve. To defeat such a foe, he must do more than uncover facts. He must break the illusion, strip away the legend, and expose Ambrose Ellison not as a martyr or rightful heir, but as the dangerous ghost of pride and envy he had always been. Only then would the living, and Lydia among them, be freed from his grip. And so, as the house sank into uneasy silence, Fenton set his mind to the task. The portrait must be revealed, its hidden image laid bare before all. For within its painted depths lay both the villain's triumph and their undoing. And he would see to it that history remembered the truth, not the lie Ambrose had left behind. The house lay in uneasy silence when Fenton prepared his trap. He had sent discreet messages earlier in the day, summoning a trusted art restorer and 2 constables to arrive at dusk. The portrait, half forgotten by those too frightened to approach it, had been moved to the study, its looming frame dominating the room like an unspoken accusation. Lamps were set so that every feature, every ridge of paint, shone in merciless clarity. The household was gathered at his request. Alice pale but resolute, Graves stiff with dread, and Rotherham attempting a mask of irritation that could not conceal his restless unease. Fenton stood before them, calm, collected. "You have all wondered," he began, "why one portrait alone could provoke such destruction, such fear. You have thought it merely Gerald Ellison's likeness, hated by him, stolen by another, coveted by none. But this portrait is not what it seems. Beneath its surface lies another painting. Ambrose Ellison, Gerald's half-brother, the unacknowledged heir. Concealed, erased, yet not forgotten. Ambrose was a man who swore he would live forever in memory, even if it meant destroying those who denied him. And someone among us has made it their mission to fulfill his vow." The restorer stepped forward, his small knives and solvents at the ready. In tense silence, he began stripping away the upper layer of paint, careful stroke by careful stroke. Slowly, like a ghost rising from its grave, another face emerged. The resemblance to Gerald was there in bone and brow, but the eyes, those piercing, defiant eyes, were different. Alive, mocking. Ambrose gazed out from the canvas at last. Alice gave a sharp cry, clutching the back of a chair. Graves crossed himself and muttered, "God preserve us." Rotherham leaned forward, his fists clenched white upon his knees. Fenton's gaze never left him. "You recognize him, Mr. Rotherham?" Rotherham's lips pressed tight. "I see only a likeness." "What of it? It proves nothing." "It proves everything," Fenton said quietly. Gerald saw those eyes and knew them for Ambrose's. He realized the past he had tried to bury could not be silenced. His death followed soon after, too convenient to be despair, too quiet to be chance. Ambrose was erased, but his shadow lived on, in you. The accusation struck like thunder. Alice gasped. Graves lifted his head in shock. Rotherham sprang to his feet, eyes blazing. "Lies! You dare accuse me of such madness?" Fenton's voice remained steady. "You knew Ambrose intimately. You were his confederate, perhaps even his son by another name. You profited most from Gerald's ruin. You entered the Ellison affairs at precisely the moment Ambrose vanished. And when the portrait threatened to reveal the truth, you struck again, first silencing Gerald, then abducting Lydia, hoping to force the past to remain hidden." Rotherham's breath came hard and fast. "You cannot prove it." Fenton stepped closer, holding aloft the torn letter. "You can disguise a hand, Mr. Rotherham, but not a habit. You always write your R's with a downward flourish, a trace that appears even when you seek to mask it. Compare this letter with the contracts you signed after Gerald's fall. They match in every stroke. You threatened Lydia's life, just as you ended Gerald's." A stunned silence followed. Alice's eyes widened in horror. Graves shook his head as if refusing to believe. Rotherham's face twisted, first with denial, then with rage. "Yes," he cried, suddenly the mask ripping away. "Yes, I wrote it. And why should I deny it? Gerald was a coward, unworthy of the name he bore. He spurned Ambrose, scorned him as though blood did not bind them. I carried Ambrose's vision forward. I ensured his name would live when Gerald's rotted in obscurity. That portrait was his triumph, his immortality. I would not let it be destroyed." He moved then, sudden and desperate, his hand darting toward the drawer of the desk, where Fenton knew a pistol was kept, but Fenton had anticipated it. With a swift motion he intercepted, seizing Rotherham's wrist and wrenching it aside. The constables leapt forward, pinning him as he struggled and cursed, his voice a torrent of venom. "You fools!" Rotherham raged. "You think you've won? Ambrose cannot be erased!" His blood, his name, they live in me. But his struggles weakened as the irons clamped around his wrists. He sagged between the constables, panting, eyes wild. Fenton regarded him coolly. Ambrose's legacy was pride, envy, and ruin. You have carried it well, but no legacy endures that is built upon lies and blood. History will remember him not as immortal, but as the shadow that destroyed all it touched. Alice covered her face, trembling. Graves bowed his head in weary relief. The portrait, half revealed now, seemed to watch them all, its mocking eyes robbed of their power at last. As Rotherham was led away, still spitting oaths and defiance, Fenton stood silent before the painting. The case was ended, yet its weight lingered. The crimes had not sprung from greed alone, but from a far darker hunger, the desire to live beyond death, no matter the cost. Ambrose had sworn he would not vanish, and through Rotherham he had nearly kept that vow. But truth, like paint stripped from canvas, had laid him bare. Fenton extinguished the lamps one by one, until only the pale dawn remained. The portrait would be preserved, but as evidence, not idle. The Ellison house could begin its slow return to peace. And Lydia, once freed from captivity by the constables dispatched on Rotherham's directions, would know at last why her family had been haunted for so long. The final move had been played, the villain unmasked. Yet in the quiet that followed, Fenton knew this case would remain with him, not for the peril, nor for the lies, but for the lesson carved deep within it, that the most dangerous crimes are not born of need, but of obsession. When a man cannot bear to be forgotten and will destroy all others rather than face the silence of oblivion. Rotherham's boots dragged across the parquet floor as the constables hauled him toward the door, his curses fading into the echo of footsteps down the corridor. The house seemed to exhale at his removal, yet the air remained taut, as though the walls themselves remembered too much. Alice stood with both hands pressed against her temples, her breath ragged, while Graves slumped into a chair as though years had been stripped from his strength. Fenton lingered in the study, his eyes fixed on the half-revealed portrait. Ambrose's gaze stared back at him through layers of time, paint, and deceit, unblinking, unyielding. Even stripped of its menace, there was something unnerving in that painted face, as though the canvas itself had absorbed the malice of the man it immortalized. Alice's voice broke the silence, trembling. "Mr. Fenton, will it never be over?" Fenton turned slowly, his composure unshaken though the weight of her question pressed heavily. "It will, Miss Ellison. But peace is not the erasure of the past. It is the acceptance of truth. The lies are gone now, and with them the power they held." She swallowed hard, nodding though her eyes remained clouded. Graves, still staring at the portrait, muttered hoarsely, "Better it had burned with Gerald." Fenton's reply was firm, though not unkind. "No. Its survival ensures no one can ever twist this tale again. The portrait will remain, but as testimony, not as a weapon." The sound of carriage wheels outside broke the stillness. The constable's cart waited to bear Rotherham into custody. Soon enough, Lydia would be returned, frightened but safe, and the household freed from his shadow. Yet even as Fenton oversaw the final arrangements, he could not ignore the lingering chill that clung to the edges of the case. Ambrose's ambition had reached beyond the grave, staining every life it touched. When the house finally settled into silence once more, Fenton extinguished the last of the lamps. He allowed himself a single glance back at the portrait, at those defiant painted eyes. For all Rotherham's ravings, for all Ambrose's pride, their legacy ended not in immortality, but in chains and sorrow. And yet, as the first light of dawn crept across the study, it fell upon Ambrose's face with a pale, unsettling glow. Fenton turned away, his footsteps measured, his mind already recording every detail. The case was closed, but its echoes would not soon leave him. Some truths, he knew, did not vanish, they lingered, carved into memory as indelibly as oil upon canvas. The Ellison house would heal, Lydia would recover, Alice would rebuild. But Fenton carried the final certainty with him as he stepped into the waiting morning air, that the most ruthless villain he had ever unmasked was not merely a man, but an idea. Obsession clothed in flesh, preserved in paint, and wielded with a madness that could not accept oblivion. Ambrose had lost. But the shadow of his defiance would never entirely fade. The constable's cart rumbled away, carrying Rotherham into the grey dawn. Within the Ellison house, silence tried to take root, but it was not the silence of peace. It was the brittle quiet that lingers when something unresolved hangs in the air. Fenton remained in the study longer than the others, gazing at the portrait still half scraped, Ambrose's eyes fixed upon him with the same unrelenting stare. He had expected relief at the conclusion of the case, yet a faint dissonance nagged at him, sharp as a splinter beneath the skin. Alice had retired to her chamber, too shaken to speak further, while Graves hovered in the hall with a glass of brandy, his muttered prayers drifting like smoke through the corridor. Fenton traced the line of Ambrose's painted jaw with his gaze. Rotherham's outburst, his confession, the evidence of the letter, it all aligned. And yet something felt too perfectly aligned. As though Rotherham had stepped willingly into the role of villain, unmasking himself with an ease that unsettled Fenton's instincts. He left the study and climbed the staircase, his footsteps hushed on the carpet runner. Lydia had been retrieved by the constables after Rotherham's capture. Frightened, exhausted, but mercifully unharmed. Fenton had briefly spoken with her upon her return, but she had been too distraught to offer more than fragments, a blindfold, a dark cellar. Rotherham's harsh commands. It had seemed conclusive, and yet, at the threshold of Lydia's chamber, Fenton paused. The maid who sat beside her bed nodded nervously and withdrew at his gesture. Lydia stirred, her eyes fluttering open at his presence. "Miss Seddy." "Fenton," she whispered, her voice raw. "Is it truly over?" Fenton pulled a chair closer and studied her pale face. "It should be. Rotherham has been taken into custody. But I must ask, did you ever see him? Not hear, not imagine, but truly see him?" Her brow furrowed. She hesitated. "I know. I thought I did once, when the blindfold slipped. A figure in the doorway. Tall, broad. I assumed it was him. Who else could it be? Assumptions." Fenton's mind sharpened at the word. "Think carefully, Miss Ellison. Did he ever address himself? Did he speak of Ambrose?" She closed her eyes, sifting memory through fear. "No, he only spoke of silence. That I must be silent, or my family would suffer as Gerald had suffered." Fenton felt the chill deepen. Silence. Not Ambrose, not immortality. That language had belonged to Rotherham in the study when the portrait was revealed. But in the cellar, someone else. He rose abruptly, his thoughts racing, and left Lydia with a reassuring nod. His path led him back to the study, where the portrait waited, its dual faces. Gerald above. Ambrose below, entwined in deception. Graves sat slouched in a chair by the cold hearth, brandy glass in hand. His eyes lifted sluggishly at Fenton's return. "You've the look of a man still unsatisfied," Graves muttered. Fenton ignored the remark and fixed him with a steady gaze. "Tell me, Graves, who first suggested that the portrait be destroyed?" The butler blinked, caught off guard. "Why, Mr. Rotherham, of course." "Not Gerald himself?" Graves frowned, searching memory. Gerald raged against it, but he never spoke directly of destruction. He wished it gone, yes, but the idea of burning it, that was Rotherham. Fenton moved closer, lowering his voice. "And who was it that fetched the portrait from storage when Gerald had locked it away?" A pause. The fireless grate seemed to deepen in its shadows. I did. At Rotherham's bidding. Fenton's eyes narrowed. Graves shifted uncomfortably, setting down his glass with a clink. The dissonance crystallized in Fenton's mind. Rotherham's hand was everywhere visible, but too visible, like a trail laid deliberately to be followed. His guilt had been loud, dramatic, undeniable. Yet the abduction bore no trace of his rhetoric, his obsession. Another hand had been at work, quieter, more calculating. "Graves," Fenton said softly, "where were you when Lydia was taken?" The butler's throat worked. "In my quarters. Asleep." "Strange," Fenton replied, "for the maid told me she heard footsteps in the hall that night. Slow, deliberate footsteps. She thought them yours?" Graves stiffened. The girl was mistaken. Fenton's gaze hardened. "Was she? Or have you mistaken me for a man who ceases inquiry at convenience?" Rotherham may have raged, but you, silent, steady Graves, you held the keys. You controlled the movements of this household. You alone had the opportunity to spirit Lydia away unseen. And when Rotherham's temper flared, you saw the perfect scapegoat. The butler's face paled, his hands trembling upon the chair arms. "You've no proof," he rasped. "No proof." Fenton drew from his pocket a scrap of fabric, a small shred he had pocketed from the cellar door, where Lydia had been held. This cloth was caught upon the latch. Coarse, plain, serviceable. The livery of a butler, not the fine wool of Rotherham's coats. Graves surged to his feet, but Fenton was swifter. In a moment the constables, summoned quietly before, stepped from the hall. Graves froze cornered, his mask collapsed. "Yes!" he spat. "I did it. I took the girl. I meant to keep her hidden. To frighten the family into silence. Gerald's death was not mine. I swear it. But his raving would have brought ruin to us all. So I continued what he began. And when suspicion turned to Rotherham, I let it fall where it would. He was guilty enough of other sins." The constables seized him, his protests bitter and broken. Alice, drawn by the commotion, appeared at the door, her hand clasped to her mouth in horror. Fenton's voice cut through the tumult, calm and inexorable. The mastermind was never the man who shouted the loudest. It was the one who walked in silence, arranging shadows around himself. You feared the truth, Graves, and in your fear you wove a web of lies. But webs always unravel. Graves sagged between the constables, his face grey, his silence finally broken. Alice's eyes brimmed with tears, not only of fear but of betrayal. The study once more fell into uneasy quiet. The portrait watching as another of its keepers was unmasked. And though dawn had broken, Fenton knew the case had tested him to its very limit. One last move had remained, hidden until the end. And in that revelation lay the truth. In every house haunted by shadows, the darkest figure is not always the ghost one expects. The house, though flooded now with the pallid light of morning, still bore the air of a mausoleum. Graves had been taken away, his footsteps echoing hollowly in the corridor as the constables dragged him to the cart that had already borne Rotherham off. Two men, both entangled in guilt, yet in vastly different shades of it. Fenton remained in the study, the ruined portrait looming like a silent witness to every confession, every lie. Alice, pale but resolute, lingered by the hearth, her fingers nervously twisting the edge of her shawl. "Will there be no end to this?" she whispered. "There is an end," Fenton said evenly, "though it is seldom the neat one we might crave. Justice has many faces, Miss Ellison, and not all of them wear the calm mask of the law." She studied him. "Troubled? You believe Graves alone was responsible for Lydia's abduction?" "Yes," Fenton replied, his gaze fixed on the portrait. "But not for Gerald's death." The words hung stark and heavy. Alice's breath caught. "Then you mean—" Gerald's death was his own doing. Fenton interrupted softly. He drank the poison by his own hand, whether in madness or some final, desperate act of control. But Graves seized the moment, built upon the chaos, and thought to silence every tongue that might disturb the family's name further. Rotherham's obsession provided the perfect diversion. You see, the case was never about Ambrose's painted face. It was about the fear it inspired, and how men twisted that fear to their ends. Alice shivered, and her eyes drifted to the mangled canvas. And the portrait itself, does it hold no more secrets? Fenton crossed to it, lifting the lamp to cast a clearer light. The scraping marks that had exposed Ambrose's hidden likeness were jagged, frantic. Yet in one corner, untouched, faint brushstrokes lingered. Not Ambrose's face at all, but the delicate outline of a key. Fenton's lips curved faintly. The truth was here all along. Gerald painted over his brother's image, yes, but he left himself a sign, the key. Perhaps a reminder, perhaps a confession of sorts. That he held the key to the mystery, and that no one else might claim it. He turned back to Alice. But others did. Graves used it to shroud his crime. Rotherham used it to validate his obsession. And poor Gerald. He simply sought to bury his shame beneath layers of paint. Alice's eyes filled. And Lydia, will she ever be whole again? Fenton's voice softened. Time must answer that. She has survived, and survival is its own quiet triumph. The door creaked, and Inspector Hardwicke entered, his boots heavy upon the parquet. His face was flushed, his manner brisk. Both men are secured. Rotherham raves of curses and legacies, while Graves. He stopped, his eyes darting to Alice, and he cleared his throat. Graves will face the magistrate. The Crown will see him tried. Will it? Fenton asked lightly, though his tone cut deeper than the question implied. Hardwicke frowned. What do you mean? Graves has confessed, yes. Fenton replied, but consider his crime. He abducted Lydia, and for that he will surely hang. Yet in truth the greater sin was his silence, his manipulation of fear, his willingness to let an innocent man bear the full weight of suspicion. The law punishes the act, Inspector, but it cannot punish the shadow cast before it. And it is in that shadow that the truest villainy lived. Hardwicke shifted uneasily, as if the words pressed against his sense of order. Justice will be served, he said stiffly. Perhaps, Fenton murmured. He extinguished the lamp, leaving the portrait half lit, half swallowed in gloom. But do not be deceived, Inspector. Justice and truth seldom walk hand in hand. One can be served while the other limps behind. Hardwicke bristled, but Alice, her voice fragile, intervened. And what of us, Mr. Fenton? What of my family? You will endure, he said with certainty. Because the truth, however bitter, is at last in the open. Secrets rot the soul, Miss Ellison. Better to suffer the light than to moulder in the dark. There was nothing more to add. Hardwicke made his bow and withdrew, his boots retreating down the corridor. Alice lingered a moment longer, then curtsied faintly, her eyes lowered in both gratitude and sorrow, before she, too, left him. Fenton remained alone with the portrait, its paint cracked, its gaze unyielding. He studied it, knowing well enough that the law would take its course, that Graves would pay the penalty, that Lydia would heal, and Alice would shoulder her family's burden with what dignity she could summon. Yet some truths resisted tidy endings. Gerald's madness, Ambrose's shadow, the legacy of silence. These would linger in the stones of the house, in the whisper of footsteps across the hall at night, in the gaze of a ruined portrait staring down generations yet to come. He sighed, drew his coat about him, and at last turned from the study. The door shut with a finality that was not final, only temporary. a seal upon a story that would echo long after the constables had gone, long after Graves had met the noose, long after Ambrose Ellison's painted eyes had faded to dust. For in the end, Fenton knew. Justice had been served, but not in full. The portrait had vanished once, and in its vanishing it had shown the peril of secrets too long buried. Now, though restored to sight, it remained a thing half hidden, a reminder that in every case there are truths the law cannot touch, motives it cannot fathom, and shadows it cannot banish. And so, with the grey dawn breaking fully at last, he stepped out into the street, his mind already turning, not to peace, but to the next mystery the world would lay before him. Fenton descended the Ellison steps into the pale wash of morning, his boots striking the cobbles with a rhythm more thoughtful than hurried. The fog had not yet burned away, its tendrils curling around the gas lamps, softening the world into a hushed, dreamlike haze. Behind him, the house stood like a fortress relieved of its siege, yet not of its ghosts. He felt them at his back even as he moved forward, shadows that refused to be left behind. The constable's cart rattled off in the opposite direction, carrying Graves toward the cold embrace of Newgate. Fenton's eyes followed it only briefly before returning to the path ahead. He ought to have felt the finality of a case resolved, the neat satisfaction Inspector Hardwicke, and the magistrates would surely trumpet by day's end. Yet within him the embers of unease glowed stubbornly, refusing to be smothered. The portrait, ruined though it was, had spoken too loudly in silence. Gerald's madness, Ambrose's legacy, Graves's opportunism, each thread tied together convincingly, and yet the tapestry felt unfinished. Rotherham's raving had been too fervent, too ready to condemn himself. Graves's confession, though raw, bore the marks of a man cornered, not entirely of one who had orchestrated every move. And there was still Lydia's uncertain testimony, fragments of voices, the command for silence, but never the names that should have confirmed her captor beyond doubt. He paused at the edge of the square, watching as the first shopkeepers lifted their shutters. A milk cart clattered by, the driver humming a tune that felt jarringly ordinary against the weight of his thoughts. It was then, from within his pocket, that he recalled the small folded note pressed into his hand by Lydia in her fragile gratitude before she retired. He had not opened it, respecting her exhaustion. Now, with the morning quiet around him, he unfolded the paper. The handwriting was shaky, but unmistakably hers. Fenton, one thing troubles me still. On the last night of my captivity, before they brought me food, a voice spoke from the dark. Not the same voice as before, softer, steadier. It said only this: not yet, she must wait. The portrait is not finished. Fenton's breath stilled. Not finished. His eyes narrowed as he folded the note again, slipping it back into his coat. Graves had spoken of silence, yes, but he had confessed nothing of completion. Rotherham, too, had raved of Ambrose's gaze, not of an unfinished portrait. Yet someone still cloaked in the shadows, had spoken those words to Lydia. The realization settled like frost upon him. The case was closed in the eyes of the law, neatly tied with confessions and evidence. But the truth remained a shifting spectre. If the portrait was not finished, then whose hand had begun the work that lay beneath Gerald's? Whose vision demanded completion? He walked on, though slower now, his gaze distant. He thought of Alice, clinging to dignity amid ruin, of Lydia, her courage threaded through her fear, of Graves, crumbling beneath pressure, of Rotherham, a broken vessel shouting louder than his sins required. And somewhere between them all, another voice had whispered. The bells of St. Dunstan's tolled the hour, their chimes ringing over rooftops. Fenton halted, his mind tightening around one last detail. In Gerald's journals, those scattered notes filled with rants and sketches, there had been mention not only of Ambrose, but of another hand. "He helps me," Gerald had written once. "He guides the brush when mine falters." At the time, it had read as another fragment of madness, another ghost haunting him. Now, paired with Lydia's note, it rang with a darker clarity. Gerald had not been alone in his obsession. The thought quickened his step. He reached the corner of the square where a hansom cab idled, its driver nodding drowsily atop his perch. Fenton considered calling it, returning at once to the Ellison house, ransacking again what had already been declared resolved. But he hesitated. No, not yet. Too soon. The family had endured enough terror for one night, and to march back now with fresh insinuations would be to reopen a wound that had barely begun to clot. And yet, he knew himself. He knew he would return. Quietly, unseen when the hour was right. He would comb Gerald's papers again, scrutinize the brushstrokes of the portrait's remnants, follow the faint trail of that other hand. For though Graves would hang and Rotherham rot in Bedlam, Fenton was certain the true end had not yet revealed itself. He stepped into the cab at last, giving the driver his lodgings. The wheels clattered over the stones, carrying him away from the Ellison Square. He leaned back, drawing the folded note once more, staring at the words until they etched themselves into his mind. The portrait is not finished. It was a message and a warning, both. Somewhere, perhaps close, perhaps far, another figure waited. Another mystery bided its time, its threads already entwining with this one. And as Fenton slipped the note away, his expression was not one of weariness but of sharpened anticipation. For in truth, a detective's work never ended. One case closed was merely the shadow of another opening. And in the fog-laden streets of London, there was always another secret, another lie, another unfinished portrait waiting to be revealed.